Madam President, Your Honors, I am Gilbert Andres. My colleague Ms. Masida earlier submitted that Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign disproportionately affected the poor and marginalized. What were the conditions of the victims targeted by Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign? How poor and marginalized were his victims? The victims targeted by Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign were from low-income, high-density communities. In an urban setting, this meant that some victims live in an area of about 69,000 persons per square kilometer during the relevant period. A typical floor area of the house of a victim in these high-density communities was about 6 square meters. For some victims, their house was as small as the area of 2 tables in this courtroom. The victims' houses were typically made up of wood, used tarpaulin, plastic, light materials, and some broken hollow blocks. Any material that they could scavenge and utilize. As the victims lived in high-density communities, their neighbors knew them very well. The victims lived in close-knit communities. The victims' close-knit communities meant that they immediately knew if a person was an outsider to their community. And any traumatic event that happened to these victims in their close-knit communities was known and whispered throughout their community. As the victims were from low-income communities, to survive poverty, their houses were homes to multiple generations of their families to conserve their meager resources. For Filipinos, especially from low-income communities, their family is not just the nuclear family. It is not just the husband, the wife, the children. Their family extends to the grandparents, the lolo and lola, and the siblings of a spouse, the brothers and sisters. The breadwinner of the victim's family was usually the husband, the father of the children. The victims either worked as daily minimum wage earners or as wage earners below the prescribed daily minimum wage, or as part of the informal economy, such as a vendor. The victims worked if there was work available to earn for their family's survival. But most of the victims would not have completed their education, nor have the proper training to secure stable jobs as part of the formal economy. If they were fortunate to be employed as minimum daily wage earners, in the urban setting, this amounted to about 500 Philippine pesos per day, or approximately about 8 euros per day during the relevant period. But for most victims, the minimum wage was really the maximum that they can hope for. The victims only hoped to earn at most about 8 euros per day. And for a family composed of the husband, the wife, and about 2 until 4 children, 8 euros per day is meager. There was also a cultural expectation for the breadwinners to help their elderly parents. The other spouse sometimes augmented this meager income by being a vendor or by taking temporary jobs. And if both parents were outside of their home, it was the extended family that took care of the children. Your Honors, the specific data may vary from victim to victim, but the victim's hope that this data give the chamber a picture of their conditions under Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign. The already marginalized and vulnerable conditions of the victims exponentially multiplied the harm that they suffered, and they continue to suffer, which leads to our next submission. What were the grave effects and suffered harm of the victims, their families, and their communities resulting from the crimes charged against Mr. Duterte? Mr. Duterte's drug war campaign targeted the very humanity of the victims, of their families, and of their communities. In Filipino, the indirect victims expressed this in one sentence: "Inalisan kami ng dangal. We were stripped of our dignity." How so? First, Mr. Duterte publicly dehumanized the victims of his anti-drug campaign. This dehumanization of the victims was used to justify their eventual murders. On July 25, 2016, during his first State of the Nation address before the Philippine Congress, Mr. Duterte declared that, and I quote, "But human rights cannot be used as a shield or an excuse to destroy the country, your country, and my country." End of quote. What was chilling was that this portion of Mr. Duterte's speech garnered the most applause from members of the Philippine Congress and the public gallery. On August 17, 2016, during the 115th Police Service Anniversary at the Philippine National Police Headquarters, Mr. Duterte declared to the Philippine National Police that for those allegedly affected by drugs, and I quote, "And it has not only affected millions, but a lot of them are no longer viable as human beings in this planet." End of quote. On August 26, 2016, Mr. Duterte declared to a group of Filipino soldiers he visited in an army camp that, and I quote, "Crimes against humanity? In the first place, I'd like to be frank with you. Are they humans? What is your definition of a human being?" End of quote. These public speeches of Mr. Duterte serve to condition the Filipino people on the excuse for the murder of the victims of his anti-drug campaign and how the murders were taken out, brazen, execution style. These public speeches of Mr. Duterte were emblematic of findings that atrocity crimes were often preceded by the process of dehumanizing the identities of others to justify the crimes. Second, the murdered victims were dehumanized by how they were murdered. During their actual murders, the targeted victims were summarily accused as drug users or pushers without the benefit of a judicial process, just like the one before this chamber. The victims were then murdered inside their homes or within their own close-knit community. The victims who were murdered inside their homes were murdered in front of their family, their spouse, their children, or their parent, especially in front of their mothers. Some of the victims were forcefully separated from the physical clutches of their family members, protecting them from the direct perpetrators of Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign. This was what happened to the son of a victim in the early hours of a Thursday. At that time, this victim, her son, and her son's wife who was pregnant and nearing delivery, were preparing to go to the hospital when 6 or 7 people dressed in black and who had guns suddenly entered their house. As recounted by this victim, and I quote, "My son kept repeating, 'Mama, don't leave me.' So I blocked the way. He pleaded again, saying, 'I will come with you, just don't kill me. Mama, don't leave me.' 4 officers were inside. One shouted at me, 'Get out of the way!' They pulled me down the stairs and yanked my hair. They had guns. My son pleaded again, 'Mama, don't leave me.' He was hugging, referring to his wife. They dragged me out into the street and put me on a motorcycle. Some victims begged the direct perpetrators for their lives, as witnessed by their family members. Some victims spontaneously took off their clothes to show to the direct perpetrators that they were clean. The home, which was supposed to be a shelter of security for the direct victims, became the crime scenes of their brazen murder. The targeting of the victims in their own homes is explained by the Philippine National Police Command Memorandum Circular number 16-2016, which was earlier referred to also by the prosecution. It was issued on July 1, 2016, by the then Chief of the Philippine National Police, Ronald Bato de la Rosa, appointed by Mr. Duterte. The relevant portion of CMC 16-2016 states that, and I quote, "The actual house-to-house visitations of suspected drug personalities shall be the highlight of Project Tonghang." End of quote. Project Tonghang refers to Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign on barangay clearance operations. Ultimately, the murdered victims were now known in their close-knit communities with the stigmatized label of natokhang and as drug users, despite the lack of any judicial declaration. Third, the murdered victims of Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign were further dehumanized even after their death by the false narrative of nanlaban. After the actual murder, the murdered victims were falsely portrayed as nanlaban, that they allegedly fought back against the police despite being the helpless victims. After the murder, evidence of illegal drugs and/or paltik guns were even planted on the murdered victims as part of the modus operandi of the anti-drug campaign to allegedly show that the victims purportedly fought back. Thus, the murdered victims were not only known as natokhang and as drug users, they were also now known in their close-knit communities with the false label of nanlaban, or someone who fought back. But for the surviving family members of the murdered victims, the suffered harms do not end there. The extreme trauma brought by the sudden murder of the Tokhang victims was further carried over to their surviving family members. Some of the surviving family members were even imprisoned and charged with fabricated criminal complaints while they were still grappling with the trauma of the sudden attack and the murder of their loved ones. For the victim I earlier referred to, after her son was forcefully separated from them, she and her son's pregnant wife were both arrested and detained in a police precinct. While under detention, she was told to get her son from the morgue. But they were not actually released from detention. They were actually photographed with the foils and rocks handed to them, and afterwards they were charged with fabricated complaints relating to illegal drugs, as that victim narrates. And I quote, "While in detention, I learned that the same thing had happened to all the other detainees. Their stories were the same. It took more than a year before this victim was released from imprisonment. The illegal imprisonment of surviving family members was part of the modus operandi to prevent the indirect victims from filing criminal complaints against the direct perpetrators of Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign. Thus, the document containing the charges in paragraph 19 refers to, and I quote, other violent crimes under Article 7.1. End of quote. Further, as the homes of the murdered Tokhang victims were the homes of multiple generations, how the murdered victims were brutally shot at have been traumatically witnessed by their family members, by their spouse, their children, or by their parents. This extreme trauma is a daily struggle for the surviving family members as they still live every day in the scene of the crime, their homes. This extreme trauma of the surviving family members also occurs when they see or about to encounter a police officer, or worse, the direct perpetrator in their community. But the extreme trauma of the surviving victims does not end there. The surviving victims were socially stigmatized in their close-knit communities with the label, "Natokhang sila," or "May natokhang sa kanila," which loosely translated means they have a family member killed in a Tokhang operation. The surviving family members of the murdered victims were avoided and shunned in their close-knit community. The neighbors avoid the surviving family members, fearing for their own lives by reason of association with the murdered Tokhang victim. And the surviving family members usually mourn alone during the wake of their murdered loved ones. For some surviving family members who cannot endure this social isolation and continuing stigma, they eventually leave their close-knit community. The trauma and stigma are especially worse for the children of the murdered Tokhang victims. Aside from losing a parent, usually their father, who is the breadwinner, the children, as direct descendants of the murdered victims, were avoided at school or even bullied as the children of Natokhang. The children of the murdered Tokhang victims have to endure bullying, stigma, trauma, depression, and some even develop symptoms such as epilepsy. And because the murdered Tokhang victims were usually the breadwinners of their families, their death meant that their surviving family members were pushed toward further poverty. The surviving family members experienced extreme socio-economic dislocation with the murder of their breadwinner. Thus, Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign aside from murdering victims from low-income communities, also brought about the breakdown of the families of the murdered victims. Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign destroyed the trust in the close-knit communities of the murdered Tokhang victims and ultimately destroyed the social fabric of these communities. Ultimately, Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign not only murdered people, but perpetrated state terror against low-income, marginalized communities across the Philippines. As a result, Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign shattered and terrorized these close-knit communities as a means of control. And ultimately, as the targeted victims of Mr. Duterte's drug war campaign were from marginalized, vulnerable communities, his drug war campaign was not really a war on drugs. It was a war against the poor. And the continued stigmatization of the indirect victims, the surviving family members, still persists until now. The children of the murdered victims are still suffering psychologically, mentally, and socio-economically. Their widowed mothers and their extended families, the grandparents, usually the grandmother, or aunts or uncles, also bear the burden of providing for the children of the murdered victims. And some surviving family members are still being visited or watched by the direct perpetrators to check on them. Last, what do these proceedings mean to the victims? The proceedings before this chamber are being watched intently by the victims because they see it as their first step towards the truth and towards justice. There is still a culture of denial that subsists even in the close-knit communities where the victims reside. The family members of the murdered victims still cannot openly discuss the murder of their loved ones in their close-knit communities. And some quarters supportive of Mr. Duterte even publicly claim that these murders under the drug war campaign allegedly never happened or were merely fake news or were justified as necessary. These hearings on the confirmation of charges are vital to the victims of Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign because it will be the first step for them in actualizing their right to the truth and to justice under international law. Madam President, Your Honors, the victims know that their murdered loved ones suffered under the charge of crimes against humanity for murder being charged against Mr. Duterte. Your Honors, the victims know, they have seen with their eyes, they have heard with their ears, and they have witnessed the barbarity of the murder wherein their loved ones' human dignity was never respected. Thus, the victims pray that this chamber confirm the charges for crimes against humanity for murder against Mr. Duterte for the sake of the truth and for the sake of justice for the victims. And so that the murderous legacy of Mr. Duterte's anti-drug campaign will not find new victims in the future. Madam President, Your Honors, thank you for your time and kind attention. This ends the submission of the Common Legal Representative for Victims. May it please the Chamber.
Judge Motok.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Andres. I gather that you have finished. So this second day of our hearings has come to an end. In accordance with our schedule, the hearing is suspended until Thursday, 26 February at 10 in the morning. Thank you, parties, participants, our interpreters, the registry, technical staff, and all those who have worked on this hearing and allowed it to be held. I wish you a pleasant day, and we will see you on Thursday. The hearing is adjourned.